Howard Cosell, one of the most significant broadcasters in television sports history, died yesterday at the age of 77. Cosell, who was once found to be the most and least popular sports announcer on television, described himself this way: arrogant, pompous, obnoxious, vain, cruel, verbose, a show-off. I've been called all of these. Of course I am. He said it himself. Joining me now to remember and appreciate Howard Cosell, Frank DeFord, a sports writer and friend of Howard's, Dick Schaap from ABC News, and Jimmy Roberts, an ESPN correspondent who is a writer and producer for Cosell. Thank you all for coming. I start with you, Frank. Tell me about Cosell. I interviewed him for 2 or 3 hours for Night Watch, and he was all of that. And he was right in saying he was all of that. But let's talk first about him as a sports journalist first, before we get into the personal and what made him Howard.
I think it's possible to argue that he was not just the premier sports broadcaster, but probably had a greater effect on sports journalism than anybody that I can think of. The great sports journalist of our times, or of this century, Grantland Rice, for example, I don't think changed anything. I think Cosell had a real change, a real effect on change in sports journalism, but curiously enough, I don't think he changed television that much. I think his effect was directly upon radio and indirectly upon the print. I think that we in the print saw this crazy guy doing what he did and were kind of emboldened by it.
But what was he doing that you weren't doing?
What he was doing was speaking up, and it's hard to believe when you can turn on the radio now and hear everybody screaming and shouting at each other. But at that time, it was very unusual for somebody to be as frank and direct and candid as Howard Cosell.
Dick Schaap.
That's absolutely true, but most of it was opinion, not journalism, not reportage. I mean, he was good at asking questions, and he liked asking questions, and he didn't shy away from asking hard questions. But this image he created of being the master journalist, a lot of that was done with mirrors. What Howard was a master showman, and his #1 creation and his #1 product was Howard. And he did a terrific job of doing that. And he understood, and he may not have changed television, but once he came to it, he understood it perfectly. And he created Howard Cosell, and that was just perfect
by
for
the way,
television.
what you say supports what I said, that we do have so much more opinion now in all media than we ever did before. And Howard obviously was on the bandwagon.
Howard showed that having opinions and promoting them and voicing them and screaming them at the loudest tenor of your voice would create attention and bring attention to you?
I think the thing I remember most about him was I think he was unafraid. And I think that he was there to ask questions that at the time, and you know, you're going back 30, 40 years, that people just didn't ask those questions. He was, you know, he characterized himself as unafraid. And while I think he had a tendency at times to sidle up to people and really get cozy with them, he never shied away, like Dick said, from asking the difficult question. And I think that differentiated him from a lot of people.
Again, I mean, he was unafraid, but after all, what was there to be afraid of? Bob Arum, Don King? It wasn't like Edward R. Murrow going after Senator McCarthy, going after someone who could kill your career in a second. Yeah. I mean, Howard, I agreed with most of Howard's convictions, but you know, they didn't take the same courage that Murrow did.
Okay, and I appreciate it. I know it may be a little bit uncomfortable to make some points that ought to be done in a full appreciation of somebody's life from the man who just died, but I think it's important, and it's the kind of thing that Howard Cosell certainly would do if he was remarking on someone else. Let me stay with that notion. Perhaps you could argue that there was great demand on the part and much pressure on Roone Arledge, for example, not to put him on a broadcast. And that Howard knew that he may be doing things that would put his place in jeopardy if Arledge wasn't prepared to stand firm.
I think in many ways Arledge was braver because Arledge had to take heat that threatened his job. I mean, Howard, they threatened his character, they threatened his personality, but those are the things that built Howard. His enemies were as important to Howard's career as his supporters were. And Arledge, knowing how effective, knowing how wonderful that marriage was between Howard and television, he's the one who had to stand up to advertisers, stand up to league officials, stand up to television officials who don't like to rock the boat.
And not only that, but the story he told the other day, that Arledge told it, that when he first put Cosell on Monday Night Football, he would have boxes of mail on his desk, and he came in and one day there was a note that Leonard Goldenson had gotten a call from Henry Ford. Get this guy off the air. You know, that's a pretty heavy phone call to get, but he stuck with him.
Charlie, part of the other thing, Dick talked about, well, who were his enemies? Well, his enemies were me. His enemy was anybody with a typewriter. Because at the time that he came in, anybody in the broadcast media was pretty much looked upon as pretty boys and second-class citizens. And Howard had to fight that, and he enjoyed fighting us. And the feuds that he had, particularly with Dick Young,
sports writer for the Daily News.
That's right. And Young would fight back. I can remember Young screaming vulgarities into people's microphones to ruin their tape. And that was the kind of competition that went on then. And Howard played off that very, very well.
But let me just stay with that notion, too. The reason he was able to overcome the odds, wasn't attractive, didn't have the same background, didn't have the great voice and all of that. Was intelligence. Also, he was willing to work hard and do his homework. You pick it up because you work with him.
Yeah, he was. Well, one of the things that impressed me about him working with him...
Not that he's the first person in sports to be willing to work hard and had brains and do his homework.
No, he had a lot of style, and he was a very, very smart man, and he would be the first person to tell you that. Yeah. And many times he did. I remember one of the amusing things that he used to say was that his view was that he was one of the 3 C's of television, the 3 most important people in the history of the medium, and each network had one. There was Cronkite, there was Carson, and there was Cosell. But he was...
And did he believe that?
Oh, absolutely.
There was no question that this was bombast. This was more de Gaullian, that I alone can save France.
Well, I think to a certain degree, picking up on something Frank said, I think that he resented and was very jealous of that, the legitimacy which the print medium had, and I think he was also terribly jealous of how presentable other people on television were. I think he viewed himself as an ugly duckling.
And there was kind of old family nouveau riche. Yeah. That was the way.
And I don't think he fit in anywhere.
Yeah, he was the new guy, and now he made his mark first in radio. Yes,
right.
He was wonderful.
And lugging around in spring training, I've seen these heavy microphones. Yeah, right. What do they call?
UHER, German tape recorder.
Go ahead. You were going to say something.
Well, see, I think Frank was bragging when he was saying he was the enemy, because actually Howard had great respect for people who wrote books, as we did. He didn't really consider us...
So the two of you he would find acceptable.
Yeah, I mean, he was incredibly nice to me in the 60s when on the radio show, had great reviews, great interviews, and he respected the written word if he respected the words that you wrote. I mean, certainly he and Jimmy Breslin had a good friendship, though Jimmy is the epitome of a newspaper man. He respected what Jimmy wrote. So Howard, as we've all said, he was intelligent, and he did appreciate good writing. He just didn't like most newspaper men.
Yeah. He just didn't like it when somebody else did it.
Right. Tell me about the notion of Cosell, and I heard this as a legend, that he could sit down and, without script, and know he had to do a 2-minute or a 3-minute radio commentary. He could do it from start to finish and end up at 2 minutes and 58 seconds.
True. I mean, it's not much more to say other than the fact that he had a talent for presentation. Rumor also started, or stories have been told, that the Monday Night Football halftime highlights were entirely extemporaneous. That's not true. That's not true. But they were embellished in his unique way. He was capable, and if you ever spent any time with him, spending time with Howard was like watching him on television or listening to him on the radio, because he was in your face and telling you what you needed to know, whether you liked it or not.
Right. I mean, one of the last times I saw Howard, we were in a restaurant that he liked. I was having dinner with Jerry Kramer, the old football player, and during each course of our meal, Howard got up from his table, came over to our table, and told us what a miserable human being Pete Rozelle was, went back to his table, and then came back to deliver the
All right, listen to this. I want you to know that we asked Roone Arledge to come here this evening. This is obviously a very busy time for the president of ABC News, but Roone Arledge played a very important role, did he not, in terms of for standing there against a lot of pressure, and in a sense could be said to have, in a way, have made Cosell, taking somebody that he believed could make a contribution. Secondly, and Roone, because of his own responsibility, declined to come. Also, Frank Gifford didn't feel like this was a moment for him to speak, but I had raised the question of Cosell with Frank Gifford when I had the Monday Night Football gang here on this broadcast, about 6 or 7 months ago, and here is what Gifford said at this time in October of 1994.
Howard was fun. You knew him early. I knew him in the 50s when I first came to New York. He was fun, he was alive, he was quick, he was witty, he was charming, and it just gradually, he began to carry some kind of a burden that he needn't have to carry as the spokesperson for everything in sports. He had only one opinion, and that was the one opinion that was right. If you were against that, you were wrong. If you were somebody that came from a different field, a different approach to journalism, you were wrong. And as things began to build and people began to question Howard as they had never in the past, he began to lash out in every which direction. And pretty soon, everyone was his enemy. And it was really kind of a terrible thing to watch.
Yeah.
And,
comment on that, because this is not an opinion held just by Frank Gifford or an observation.
I think I worked for him at a time when he was writing, along with Peter Bonventry, I guess not the last book, but the second to last book, I Never Played the Game, which was one of his favorite double entendres. And that was a difficult time.
The reason I'm the best is because I never played the game. There are too many ex-jocks in the broadcast booth.
Right, and it was a difficult time. I remember being in the office every day and hearing him screaming and railing and ranting and raving, and we've got to add another chapter to the book right now. And you know, he'd be on the phone with Al Davis, or if it wasn't Al Davis, it was some, you know, executive from ABC Sports who he was railing against because they had switched the time slot for his show, and everything had some kind of hidden meaning to it. And he was angry and bitter.
At what?
Man, if I knew. Everybody.
I've never met a person who wouldn't have traded lives with Cosell. I mean, he had a wonderful, magnificent life. He had a family that loved him. He had a great career. He had great financial success. And yet, he was unquestionably bitter with everyone. A friend of mine took a course at Princeton about 10 years ago in which Howard was a guest lecturer, and my friend sat there and kept notes on how many people he knocked by name. And in a lecture of a little more than an hour, he knocked 200 people by name. That may be the AAU record for that.
He was terribly insecure, which of course is so odd. Even at the absolute height
with all the talent.
And at the height of his powers, there was always an insecurity. He always said, and he acknowledged that it came from growing up Jewish in Brooklyn in the Depression. And he sort of never got over that.
But
this is the new
growing up
Lurishan
Jewish
and
in
establishment.
Brooklyn was not a stigma.
No.
But the point is how he perceived it, because that's what defines your experience and your character.
I know, but it's like you think I was poor. You think you were poor. You should have seen how poor I was.
You know, I remember being with he and his wife, and I didn't spend an awful lot of time with Howard. I don't want to give the impression that I was a lifelong, colleague of his, but there were a couple of years there where I worked for him. And I remember going to the Kentucky Derby one year with him and his wife and being on the plane, and it was just the three of us. And I had been working for Howard for a couple of years, and Howard bended knee to no one until we got on that airplane. And I remember sitting there the entire flight, shocked with my jaw dropped at how deferential and sweet and kind he was to Emmy. And it was amazing. And I got off the plane, and I wanted to know if there was some of that left over for all the rest of us, but
it was the most amazing relationship. Emmy died about 4 years ago, and I think that the air really went out of Howard at that point. He had absolutely adored this woman, and you would not think that there was anything that they had in common. She was a Philadelphia Presbyterian who had literally told me had met one during her life before she married Howard, and he didn't know any more Philadelphia Presbyterians than she did Brooklyn Jews. And she could, just by rolling her eyes up, stop him dead in his tracks.
Yeah.
And it was one of the most loving, adorable relationships that a man and woman ever had.
You know, he used to say, and this has been many times repeated, but for all those years that he didn't win an Emmy Award, he said, "I don't need one. I've already got the only Emmy I will ever need."
Yeah. Muhammad Ali, his best moment?
Oh, indisputably. This was equivalent to, say, Edward R. Murrow, who was his great hero. Murrow taking on McCarthy and Howard taking up the cause of Muhammad Ali were very analogous. And he was. It was a proud moment. There were an awful lot of us in the sports press who stood aside when that happened, which is, by the way, an interesting reflection of the times when we look back and understand that. I was at Sports Illustrated then. We could have easily supported Muhammad Ali, and we kind of stepped aside.
Sports broadcasting today, doing what Cosell did, putting aside arrogant, pompous, obnoxious, vain, cruel, verbose, show-off.
And those are good points, yeah.
Is there, you do the sports reporters on ESPN, and you're on ESPN.
With Howard's picture.
Yeah, with
looking
Howard's
over our
picture,
shoulder,
exactly.
yeah.
Is there, in terms of a regularly scheduled network sports correspondent who's doing the kind of sports journalism that Howard Cosell did? Do we make too much of this? Or, in fact, was he one of a kind and no one there is doing what he did today?
I don't think anyone is doing precisely what he did. I think there are people who are doing pieces of it. But I think, again, the main thing Howard was doing was being Howard, and he was a sensational Howard. And I don't think there's anybody quite like that on the air. I mean, in some small way, Chris Berman, with whom we work, is like that, in that Chris is very loud, and Chris dominates a scene when he enters upon it, but not to the extent that Cosell did. And there are other people. I mean, there are times when Bob Costas does commentary, which is very similar. Bob has a great command.
But Bob Costas does not have the forum that Howard did to do the kinds of things that Howard did.
Right, no one has that forum right now.
Yeah,
No.
and is that because no one is big enough to fill those shoes, or because the networks have changed and they don't want someone like that around?
I don't think they wanted someone like that around, even when he was around.
Yeah.
But so I don't think that's the explanation. I think that there's no one.
I'm
out
not talking
there
about the controversial opinions,
Yeah.
less so than the obnoxious, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, no, they don't like boats to be rocked in network television. But if you could rock it as he did, it worked.
That's why I said at the beginning that, curiously enough, I think he's had less of an effect upon television than upon the other mediums. Yeah. I think he's set much more of a standard for radio, which has continued, and he inspired a great many people in the print, which I think is one of the great ironies of all.
Yeah, it is. But interesting, when a new show on HBO in which you contributed, you talked about the Masters. I mean, they wouldn't tolerate any criticism of the Masters, would they? And CBS, as a network, understood that and wanted to do the Masters and really understood the game.
Oh, absolutely. You've got to remember that what separates sports from the other part of the news is that all the networks own sport. They're all, CBS does not own the Republican Party for 4 years. Yeah. CBS does own the Masters, and CBS owns the NCAA. And so sports is entirely different from other element of the news because of that.
How should we remember him then, Dick? Howard Cosell. Give me your own.
Well, I think Frank says, you remember him loudly. First of all, you hear the voice. And I personally would like to thank him for making it acceptable not to have a great voice and not to be beautiful and still go on television, because he certainly paved the way. But I'll remember his strong opinions. I'll remember him standing with Ali. I'll remember him standing with John Carlos and with Tommy Smith. And I'll remember, too, in the background, him screaming at some people who shouldn't have been screamed at.
And that's, of course, a natural segue to me, because I was one of those people that he screamed at.
You deserved it.
Yeah, I know. I will remember him, and I've thought a lot about him this week. I will remember him as a man who was unafraid. And I think that he changed the tenor of the discussion between, for me at least he did, between athletes and the media. It was all right to be confrontational if what you wanted was an answer. There was no obligation to just ask the questions that they wanted to have asked. That's how he changed it for me personally, and I think that's a good legacy. If you want to remember him fondly, that's the way you should remember Howard.
He elevated, I will always remember, he elevated this part of the business, the electronic medium. I will also remember him for managing to mix so well show business and solemnity. He could do it so well. You didn't have to be one or the other. And I also remember him myself personally as good company, good wit, good to be around.
I thank all of you very much. Howard Cosell died at 77 years old, having had, as we've all learned this evening, an extraordinary career with impact. And many of us go through this life without being noted or having an impact or drawing controversy, and clearly Howard Cosell did. Thank you, Frank. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Dick. Thank you for...